This week, we discuss bootstrapping cloud security for small teams. In the news segment, insider threats hit headlines, Double Free gives WhatsApp a 1-2 punch, pitfalls to avoid in security monitoring, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV courses live and on demand, so there's no need to send staff to off-site training. Team subscriptions include Pro Portal, so managers have full control over your team's training schedule. Go to itpro.tv/ASW and use the code ASW30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies. Protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week, Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences. Demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 79, recorded October 7th, 2019. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hey, Matt.
Good morning. Look, the Broncos won, so I get to wear my orange today.
You are a sea of orange this morning. That is quite impressive. We're also here with John Kinsella. Hey, John.
Howdy. I'm just happy to be home.
Yeah, we're just happy you're back.
Yeah, we haven't talked to you in a while. This is good.
I know. Feels like forever.
Yeah.
Yep.
Welcome home.
We do have exciting news about the Security Weekly webcast program. We are now partnered with ISC Squared as an official CPE provider. If you attend any of our webcasts, you will receive 1 CPE credit per webcast. Register for one of our upcoming webcasts with Ajit Chetty of Preempt, Bryce Schroeder and Barbara Kay of ServiceNow, or Steve Levenstein of Core Security, or all of them, by going to securityweekly.com. Click the webcast drop-down and select Registration. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find our on-demand library by selecting On Demand from the webcast drop-down. EC Council is now offering our listeners a free pass to attend the 2-day conference. Use discount code HH19SW when you register, or go to securityweekly.com/hackerhalted and register there. We don't have a guest this morning, but we do have, I think, a question that is probably important for a lot of our listeners out there. And that's, how do you start cloud security? How do you go into one of the cloud service providers? You have a DevOps team, but you don't have a security team. So you're a small team. You're not one of the big Googles, Microsofts, Netflixes that we often talk about that are actually releasing open source tools and talking about great zero trust designs of their network architectures because they have massive budgets and massive teams. So one of the things I wanted to pull back on was, remember those small teams. How do you get started whether you don't have even someone officially tasked with security and your DevOps team is deploying out to production, or you have a team of 1 to 3 people that's tasked with security, and how can they start that DevOps, that DevSecOps culture and make a really good impact without just struggling every step of the way? So that's what I wanted to. That's sort of what I wanted to seed us with this morning. And Matt, John, there's a couple different directions we can go here, but let me turn it over to you two and see if one of you has a particular item that you tend to jump on in this type of scenario.
It depends.
Please go ahead.
Well, it depends a little bit, I think. One is, do you want to focus first on aspects of the cloud infrastructure that you're deploying to, or do you want to try to, kind of shift more left and figure out what to do as part of the CI/CD pipeline, because sometimes it's hard to figure out where do you start in a kind of like a greenfield environment, right? If you don't have a security team or a small security team and you're moving into the cloud with DevOps, you can pick either of those two. And I think a lot of it depends on what's the plan for deployment, right? If you're running dedicated infrastructure as a service in your own Kubernetes, you could start there and just make sure that those hosts, that the Kubernetes environment is configured correctly and set up. But if you're moving into a platform as a service offering like container as a service or Fargate, where maybe the underlying infrastructure in the cloud you don't really have a lot of control over, then maybe you actually start a little earlier on the dev side of the process and say, where can we integrate some security checks earlier into the pipeline? So I think it depends depending on some of those scenarios.
That's true. And I know a lot of times you like to also hone in on that aspect of that asset inventory and application inventory. So even starting at the further end, like at the deployment stage or as it's been deployed, getting that inventory early is just going to have it's a great investment because you're going to get benefits from that later on when you do start to talk about what's our threat modeling look like, or when we go through threat modeling exercises, or what does our risk look like? What are we actually trying to protect? So that's one of those areas I see what you're saying and try to choose the two. I like that aspect of jumping on the inventory early, and then figuring out how to secure that over time.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, John. I'll let you chime in here.
I think one of the you're going down the right direction, but I think one of the sort of the key points, just to sort of speak it out between, the mega corps versus, I don't go one into the other, but the mom and pop, say like a company with 20 people, is in a mature security program, you have learned to actually bring SecOps or DevSecOps in when you're doing that initial design and architecture of the package of this, whatever that software is, versus usually in a startup or a small company, you've been going at it for at least a few weeks, if not months, before someone realizes, someone's finally starting to ask that security question we should go and do about it. So you're stepping into it when you're sort of in the middle of it. So that's the reason why you need to stop with, get the inventory done, figure out what is it I'm dealing with, and that can be a lot harder than it sounds, even if it's just like a one-person shop. What were you working on 6 months where you created an account somewhere and you've forgotten about it, unless you've been really diligent about tracking all those accounts and passwords and everything you've used. So I think that's sort of the first thing, is really just sort of wrapping your hands around what do I have to actually deal with here, and then from that sort of start stepping through. Maybe actually put yourself on some sort of like a timeline. We're going to do one thing every week or so, and actually just sort of slowly chew on this and not try to, swallow from the fire hose over a weekend.
Yeah, and that's why I said, depending on where the organization is and how they're deploying, that discover phase is really important. And that's why I said, look, we do this at Security Weekly, right? We still roll our own infrastructure today. Now, Paul and I are looking at moving that into things like Lambda and Fargate to reduce some of the infrastructure components in our layout. But we still have dedicated EC2 instances in Amazon. We're rolling our own container into that environment. And that's why I said, if that's what you're doing, that's one of the first places I would start. What's that inventory look like? How many EC2 instances? What containers are out there running? And that gives me a foundation to do basic assessment activities, right? Because vulnerability discovery, configuration management are still two of those core early disciplines once you understand your inventory. And I would start on the runtime side first in that scenario. Then I would go look at the software side, because I need to do the same thing over there. Is I need to understand, well, what's in those containers? What libraries, what binaries? Do they have vulnerabilities? How are they configured, right? And so I can shift from a runtime kind of hardware infrastructure discussion, then shift back into a software inventory and going through that same vulnerability configuration management components. To me, that's kind of like the 1-2 kind of table stakes approach of how to kind of get your arms around both sides of that.
Yeah, when you look at that, the software on the creation side, that's where you can, if you're going into github.com, GitHub has built-in ways of scanning for those dependencies. Even we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Dependabot. So it will even send you a PR that says this library looks out of date. Click to accept on this PR, and now you'll be up to date. So that's one of those things talking about third-party dependencies, that side of software inventory. You don't even have to reinvent the wheel there. It's not even that the wheel has been invented. This is a spinning wheel that is like well honed, and I'm losing my metaphor here, but it's going to make that part of your life a lot easier. So then you can step back and actually say, kind of what John alluded to, what are we building and what could go wrong? That idea of threat modeling, and it doesn't have to be really in depth. You could even look at Mozilla has a great reference called a rapid risk assessment, and they just have it on a single page, 5 or 6 questions that can always benefit from deeper security knowledge, but you don't need deep security knowledge just to start thinking about what if somebody has credentials and gets to a user. What if somebody gets into our EC2 instance? Or even just what you were just saying there, Matt, what if we repeat the mistakes that all the big companies are making with an S3 bucket or an Elasticsearch? That configuration management gets really scary, and how do we stay in front of that?
Exactly. And Paul actually uses the GitHub functionality to identify when he has out of date versions of Python, for example, right? That's a typical tool that's free and available if you're using Git that does that basic check for you. Then I would go to the next step. Once you kind of get that piece down, right, then as part of your build, you're trying to pull in all the right libraries. Then when you build out that container binary, there are other tools out there. Claire was the open source product. I assume that's still available even after the Red Hat acquisition. That was an open source. And then there's commercial versions of those software composition analysis tools as well.
Yeah, I'd suggest, and I think it comes down to who are we thinking about for that target customer or target user. But I'd go another step back. Look at your spam folder. Look at your credit card receipts. I'm more interested in trying to help that person who's like, remember, right? We're talking about someone who they've been, at least in my mind, they've been clicking and pointing and trying different things for the last few months, and now they're starting to get serious. So it really is trying to figure out where does that stuff come from. So look at the credit card receipts. Is there something on there that you're getting charged for you forgot about? Is there spam coming in where some service you signed up for? So I'm really thinking about furthering back still. And then once you figure out all those things, then you can do, some of the stuff Matt's thinking about, which is definitely spot on. But I think a lot of people don't even have that. It's great if everything you're doing is in Azure or Amazon, but I suspect a lot of people have made a few bumps in the night before they pick something and stuck with it. So
yeah,
think bigger.
Yeah, that's a good point, John, right? Sam and I go through the finances every month going, what's that service over there, right? Because you buy a lot of third-party services, right? We use HubSpot integrated in other tools, but you got to go back through the credit card bill to find some of those other tools where data might be stored. Because even if you're building your own application in-house, there's probably integration points to other software or third-party services that maybe you have forgotten about. How are they configured? How are you authenticating to those? Are those API authentication requests secured or not secured, right? But first you have to know that they exist before you can start going down that path and protecting some of those other data sources.
Yeah, you just gave me a good one. Also go back through your OAuth, the accounts you've given OAuth access to in either GitHub or LinkedIn or Twitter or, oh God, probably someone's using Facebook, or all those type of things, right? So where else have you sort of granted to let someone scan that repo? Or again, how do you keep track of sort of the peripheral things around the edges here is what I'm thinking about. And actually, it's you guys, as you're saying, you're doing that monthly review of finances, and Security Weekly is a little more mature. But for a lot of those small companies, they might not be doing that, right? I've been in that situation where a startup's been around for a year, and then an investor says, "Hey, show me the books." I was like, the what? So, it's the earlier you get the control of those type of things and have a little more mature process, nothing but good comes from it.
That's why it's always good to have financial folks on your team that knows how to balance a budget.
Yeah.
And I think you guys are kind of calling out there too, is that one of the best ways to compromise a network is with valid credentials. So whether it is a OAuth token that has been pulled down, compromised, or you're using, you granted OAuth via OAuth token some third-party access to your developer account on GitHub, for example, or Heroku or something like that, suddenly you have this chain of potentially weak links. An attacker just needs to get one of those, start back into that developer's laptop, or even not, people don't need root anymore. They need access to be able to deploy some code or change some source code or pull some data. So where is that data sitting to? So those ideas of audit your OAuth, what you've been granted, either both for your humans as well as all those services that are interacting with different clouds, whether they're little clouds or big clouds, and absolutely throwing on two-factor authentication or some form of multi-factor authentication is going to put you get you a long way ahead of other types of mistakes that can happen.
Especially if you're dealing with Twitter when they think that you have a locked account and they unfollow all your followers. I spent all weekend back and forth with Twitter support on this exact thing because they're like, well, just change your password. So I changed my password. I'm like, you still have it locked. Then I had to go through and ungrant access to all the other sessions. So I did that. And then I took off all the software grants, right? And it was LinkedIn and Hootsuite, which we use to do our Twitter blasts for the show. And there's, iOS for my iPhone, right? I had to disable all those. And still, they forced me to reset my password 4 times before they finally unlocked my account this weekend. So all my followers are back. I know I lost a couple during this process, but this is what I mean by these types of applications and other access rights. Sometimes they look malicious to people like Twitter, and then they lock down your account and really cause you about 5 days of grief.
That's what you get for all those Bronco posts.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so
if their Bronco posts are screaming at Elway about how bad he's run the team, but that's a whole different discussion.
So 4 password changes, you're up to Broncos rule 4. Is that what your password is by now?
So it took him 5 games, so Broncos rule 5.
Gotcha.
Let me throw one more in there, and then we can go to more interesting stuff. But Matt just gave me one more. Change your password. Watch what breaks. Right? Something is going to, and again, these sound sort of like no-duh things, but for a smaller organization or someone's trying to figure this stuff out, one of my favorite things is when I see someone on LinkedIn or Twitter follow me because they're new in the industry and they've seen me on here or wherever else, and they're trying to learn, but okay, well, just change the password and see what breaks, right? It's if there's some automation out there or all these sort of I'm looking at this, I guess. In a way, I'm sort of doing the reverse of a hacker thing, right? A hacker's going to come, a malicious user is going to come along and they're looking for all the edge cases which you're not thinking about so they can take advantage of it. And I'm looking for those edge cases so that you can actually figure out what are those pieces which you might have missed and sort of get a better understanding of what everything looks like.
Yeah, and I was going to take that from a slightly different angle and say, make sure you actually can change passwords. And this is more about not for the humans, but at the service and APIs you're interacting with, because it's inevitable that someone is going to post the password to GitHub, is going to get cut and pasted into an email somewhere, or, especially small teams, there's often quite a lot of churn within teams. So if you have great encryption story, you're encrypting everything and before it drops into S3 buckets, stuff like that, but you can't rotate that password, you can't rotate the secret for that particular encryption method or that particular API you're consuming, then you're kind of stuck if there is some event that happens that you actually need to change it, and it takes you a week, a month, or some like this cascades of failures while you're trying to figure out what's actually breaking. So there's other great reasons for being proactive and understanding how to do that rather than just saying, oh, we know it's a really long password and we're okay.
Yeah, mine are really long and auto-generated 4 times this weekend.
Well, one of the things, so it's one of the things for us to say, check those configurations, but cloud providers, especially I'll pick on AWS a little bit, that gets a lot of like alphabet soup between what are the different services and this identity model and all the ARNs. It's can get really confusing. And a lot of times what can happen is someone may just say, here, let's just throw a wild card on there, or let's grant admin, and then we'll narrow it down, some date in the future, but we just got to get this up and running. So what comes to mind for you guys in this sense of, here's an open source tool that can help, or here's something within the cloud provider that actually makes it easier. Here's the design pattern that means we cannot we can start off with least privilege rather than give everything and then try to decay it over time.
Yeah, this is where I think open source gets really difficult.
Yeah.
Google has an open source tool. I can't remember the name of it. Somebody built it. I'll have to go find it. I'm drawing a blank off the top of my head. But somebody built an open source tool to do pieces of this in Google. But when you look at Amazon and Microsoft today, there aren't good open source tools to do configuration validation. Microsoft's done a better job, I think, of producing benchmarks and security kind of policies for their products. I know Amazon's built some best practices for some of theirs, but to validate those, there's not a lot of open source choices here. It's mostly the commercial tools where we're seeing some traction here. And I see them at two different sides. Most of those commercial tools that are out there are validating the running environment of your cloud, different services that are up and running, right? So there's a number of commercial products that kind of log into your console, pull down the configurations, and validate them against a set of policies baselines. I'm starting to see emerge some new technologies that are looking to validate those configurations before they actually spin up the infrastructure. And I think that's a really interesting place to be in the industry, because as we define everything as code in these new DevOps environments, the ability to validate configuration settings prior to pushing them to production and identifying security weaknesses and configuration gaps, I think is really interesting. It reduces the attack surface, but I think it's also easier and faster to fix than checking it all the way over in production. But again, these are all commercial tools. I don't see much on open source.
Yeah, and that's starting to get us into a tougher decision-making process, because if we're already trying to find somebody who can balance the books, or even to say, wait, what books? That probably means there's not necessarily a big budget for diving into some of these commercial tools. But by the same token, you make a pretty good case that if there's not anything that's open source that's going to help, and there's a lot of time to spend on making sure it's, manually, how do we do this right with or even infrastructure as code. Maybe commercial has to be this case, but at what point would you start to say, yeah, we're ready for this, in the sense of we actually have, we're on version 1 of our product, we're getting ready to roll out the product, or we're at a certain engineering size? What might make you think that you're ready to actually dive in with a purchase like that?
Well, let's see. I'm a startup, and I'm out and I got some seed funding, and I'm building a minimal viable product that I want to go get some customers and revenue, and I'm getting ready to go raise my Series A. Do I want to breach in my cloud environment during that process? I'm just saying, right? And I think that's the potential concern, is that one misconfiguration in a cloud environment as you're building up your MVP potentially gets you a breach really early in the process. Now, maybe attackers aren't going after you because you're still kind of under the covers, but if it's egregious and it's available, somebody's going to go pop that thing. That's the issue. That's my concern, right? Especially in a startup mode.
Yeah, and I think also too that people are not even necessarily targeting startups. They're just targeting and scanning on a continuous basis. Let me find something in S3. Let me find something in Elasticsearch, et cetera. Yeah. And this looks world readable. Cool. I'm just going to dump it, and then next week I'll go through and see if it had anything interesting. I'd also say, kind of as one of these motivating factors, if I'm possibly one of the consumers of this, let's say it's like a B2B type of SaaS platform rather than consumer focused. If I'm doing my third-party due diligence, I'm going to have a lot of questions. Be like, oh, and what data am I sharing with you? Are you actually going to protect the data? Do you have some level of sophistication that you even know if there was a, just basic security configuration? Do you have basic security practices? So not even looking at something like, tell us how mature you are on the NIST cybersecurity framework, but are you at least doing some very basic things, like possibly even, and I don't know how much this would be weighed, but have a WAF on top of like these security configuration aspects? How far does a WAF get you in this day and age? And maybe we need to redefine exactly what we mean by a WAF, because I think it's a little bit different from that appliance that we used to, 1U appliance that we would throw into a rack 15 years ago.
Yeah, we didn't continue to go up the stack yet, and a WAF does
Right.
play into that scenario. But let me give you a perfect example. One of the startups I've been advising, cloud-based platform, right? And as you start to build customers and you start to go after larger customers, the questions come up: where's your SOC 2? Right? So think about
There
that.
it is.
Where are you in your SOC 2 analysis as a startup, which is going to bring a lot of these controls to bear as part of your cloud platform? And then how do you implement those? Now, luckily, most, if you think about, you can get around aspects of certain controls in a SOC 2, right? I could say I have a web application firewall in place, to your point, Mike. Then I can look at, well, if I'm running an Amazon, maybe I'm running Amazon's WAF, which is from a cost perspective pretty very cost effective, right? Versus a commercial product. But if you want more functionality to the point where it's protecting APIs and misconfigurations and other things, then you need to look at a commercial tool like a Signal Sciences or something like that, where they have protection and agent mechanisms in place that interact with the web app firewall that continually do ongoing protection. So if there is a vulnerability or a misconfiguration identified, it's updating some of the WAF rules and really putting you in a better protected state. But those are commercial-based products now. So now your price point's going to go up over maybe just the basic functionality of an Amazon WAF.
No, that's true. And so trying to loop us back to, or I guess put into perspective all the steps we've gone through. We talked a little bit about development, a little bit about having that conversation in the sense of lightweight threat modeling. We didn't necessarily we talked about CI/CD pipeline in the terms of what are all the other services that it's touching to, sort of that API security. Are you using GitHub that launches, that ties in with Jira or Jenkins or something else? All of these different deployment tools that finally get you into some cloud provider. But I guess we didn't also talk about, what about building the app itself, building the code? And then that further end of the spectrum, we're kind of approaching this from two very opposite ends. At the runtime, we haven't gone into too much monitoring, and WAF starts to get us there, but that monitoring and logging, that's one of the OWASP top 10 failures, both for the old top 10 as well as API security. So I'm curious now, if we're going to take that path between shift left early or runtime, which way should we go? And John, I'm curious if you have a flip a coin here, and which you would choose.
Yeah, monitor first. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, right? It's if I can't, and this will sound like one of our catchphrases right now, but if I can't see it, then I can't secure it. And it really comes down to, for me, there's the operational aspect too, right? So the more monitoring we have in there, the more my fingers on the pulse of that application. I'm able to then see, not just from a security point of view of what's going on, but also that helps me from a troubleshooting point of view. Is my disk I/O slowing down? Is my disk filled up? Well, let's not go there. Is my disk at 90% capacity?
Right.
Are we seeing spikes in our network traffic? Are we seeing, if we're going towards Fargate or something like that, are we seeing more instances being spun up? Are instances dying and they're restarting a lot? So, a lot of this data, as you start to gather and put those pieces in place, there's security value to it, but there's also operational aspects to it. And so the tricky part right now, and I'll Google a name on this in a second when we're talking, is, so let's see, we've now just talked about resource monitoring, cloud monitoring, probably some amount of like actual application monitoring through Grafana or Prometheus, something like that. So I've already talked through 3 and I haven't really got going too far. If you bring a WAF in, that's something else. So oddly, before we even, last 30, 45 seconds, I've now talked about 4 or 5 things you need to somehow be able to manage and see either in one location or have some sort of grasp of what's going on and keeping that data together. So that's where the stuff gets, as you become more mature, you suddenly part of that maturity is trying to figure out how do I deal with all this data without, going absolutely insane.
That's true. Absolutely insane or absolutely breaking the budget either, because you have to store all that data over time if you want to actually do some analysis on it. But one of the things that really stands out there is that a couple of the first items you were rattling off are very
Mhm.
engineering focused. And obviously, I think they have a great story and aid to like application security monitoring or doing when you need to do investigations. But it's definitely setting up the expectation that, hey, DevOps team, engineers, you're building this application. Clearly, monitoring is a helpful habit to get into. Let's build it, let's establish it. And oh, by the way, there's going to be some security benefits that are going to emerge from this. So it's not even saying that this one security person or this non-existent security, half-time security person is one advocating for monitoring and logging. It's that engineering team that wants that feedback and is going to benefit from it. And by the way, yeah, let's actually throw in maybe some WAF or some other type of security events in there. But I think that's a great way to approach it and build that culture of DevOps that cares about security.
Yeah, and so I was going to mention this when we were talking a little bit earlier about this with Matt a few minutes ago. So the way I think about that overall, I'm going to go back to a previous question and then come into this. So how do we secure and manage these things once we start dealing with them? And like you were talking about, how do we do config management on your Amazon account or things like that? So from my point of view, and this will sound slightly consultancy because I've spent too much time in that life, but I wanted to do two things. I want to first stabilize that patient, understand what's going on there, stabilize what's there, patch the criticals, and actually sort of get some level of control over things so I can get a little bit of sleep at nighttime. And then my own personal thing is I want to start rebuilding that into a new environment. So either with Amazon, Amazon's IAM, or either create a new account or create a complete separate new account, right? So start, first you move pieces over, and how you move those pieces over, in my mind, would be through automation. So you start building out your Ansible scripts or your Terraforms or whatever you have to, so that as you test these things and make mistakes and sort of figure out what that configuration should look like, when you make a mistake, you just blow it away and recreate it. So now let's go a little bit further here to where we are now. And now we've got that maturity. We've built maybe not everything in that new environment. We've got to the point we feel comfortable with using Ansible and Terraform or Puppet or SaltStack or pick whoever you want. We feel comfortable actually defining and rolling out our services in there. As we actually start to bring new releases out, we start bringing them into that new architecture. And at some point in time, the old guy's going to have nothing left, or maybe one thing, and at some point you just have to get the gun and shoot it, right? But now with these new things, as you get a little more comfortable, you start adding in not just the application and the disk usage and all those sort of standard resource bits, but now you also add in monitoring, right? You get like a Prometheus module for Ansible or whatever have you that says, these are the ports in this application I should be monitoring. These are the types of things I should be looking for. Your logs are suddenly starting to go to Elasticsearch or whatever Amazon calls their log aggregator. And you start using something like maybe either ElastAlert or something like that to look for key phrases in your logs that say, hey, if I see this, either there's an exception being thrown or someone's attacking me. I see, 5 failed logins in a minute or in a second. So this thing starts becoming more and more, I'm overusing mature, but a lot more sort of, it has a life of its own. So now at this point, somewhere along here, you're either have picked a tool which is going to be really useful for you and it's going to scale with you, or if it was like, remember Puppet, I don't know what, 5 years ago, you're going to start running into some scaling problems here at some point. I know they've got over that now. But so, and at some point you might have to go back and do this whole thing again and reboot into another tool and bite that bullet and do it again. But I think, at least when I think about this way, I've done this in the past. We did this layered insight. We went through, I think, either 3 or 4 revs of our infrastructure. I've done it at previous companies, and that's just sort of the way I think, and it's what works for me, is like, we always learn, right? And you can't always implement those learnings in the current platform that you're using. Sometimes you just have to go and start over and take that into account when you do it the next time.
That sounds like a great recipe. Small iteration, build up the automation within it, and apply testing along the way, so you have confidence that as you're making, you're ripping out one tool for another, that migration is actually going pretty well. That what you've described sounds like a very healthy kind of DevOps approach that just so happens to be also pulling security along with it, I would say, rather than even security leading the way, which I think is kind of what we're seeing a lot more with the modern DevOps mentality anyway.
And I think, it's those two, at least for me, they go hand in hand. But I think, and maybe you've got your stuff in Ansible. Maybe you've just used Ansible and you're still spinning up the servers by hand. At some point, you're going to say, hey, it's that thing of what happens if I need to rebuild this, or could I rebuild this in a better fashion? Or, we talked about the questionnaires from the customers. At some point, they're going to ask about what's your DR plan, or what's your MTTR, or all these type of things, right? So, hey, maybe we need to automate the creation of the instances. So let's start going and looking at Terraform. Or maybe you've listened to an episode of Security Weekly and you heard about a monitoring platform you liked, or whatever else, something out there went through your Google newsfeed and said, hey, that's sort of interesting. That's a way I could improve. One of my first things I do, I think we've talked a little bit in the past about how do I look at open source projects, but just looking at this particular space, one of the things which might cross my mind is, hey, is there a module for that for X automation tool? I keep talking about Ansible, so let's talk about Chef instead. Maybe, and I've never used Chef, so bear with me, but maybe there's a recipe out there for a Chef that allows us to do this on that platform instead. And instead of me having to actually go and type stuff, which might take me a week to go in QA and test this, maybe there's a plugin out there that 1,500 people are using actively. So suddenly I'm able to actually, do that whole standing on the shoulders of giants and allow my stuff to come up quicker. And I'm going to do a hard turn on this again, because we were talking about, we briefly talked about the application and what's going on there and how do we secure that. And one of the things we didn't talk about is, well, we didn't talk about that much, but in my point of view, when I'm starting a new project, whether, it's something I'm scrambling on for a weekend or maybe something a little more meaning, what technologies am I using? Looking at something like what languages do I want to use? What does their security structure look like? Is there good defaults? And this, again, we have to be having this conversation at the beginning of that project, not you don't want to rewrite something halfway down the road because you realized JavaScript sucks.
Yeah, we've tried that before. It doesn't work very well.
Yeah, but that's sort of, it's some of these type of things you think through, and then hopefully you'll be able to actually use those, leverage some of those values you have there, bring it back into this automation stuff, and these things benefit off each other.
Yeah. Are there good linting tools for the language you're supporting so you can plug those right in right away, right? Because Paul's using linting in Python to do a lot of our checks up front. And then you look at your different build systems, right? Are there specific plugins and tools that help you validate aspects of vulnerabilities in your libraries and misconfigurations? It's part of that process, right? And if you're starting from scratch, it's easier to have those conversations. I think it's much harder when the organization has something in place and now they're trying to retrofit some of the stuff back into tool choices they've already made and or infrastructure design choices they've already made.
And I think I want to jump on that point too, because we're talking about small teams. We're talking about the pain points that small teams have in terms of there's only so much time of the day, you have limited budgets. But a small team could also be part of a big organization that's actually trying to adopt a DevOps or DevSecOps approach, shifting from that, moving off of some legacy tech debt, moving off of the old school waterfall type of development. So a lot of what we're describing here are problems that small teams will have, even if those small teams are much part of a much, much bigger organization trying to affect some of that cultural change. And what I want to call out for our listeners, I think John was really good at describing that a lot of different teams, are probably running into the same problems, and maybe someone else has solved this. So there might be a small open source tool that addresses this one particular pain point in Chef or this other particular pain point over in Ansible. So listeners, if you do have some of these favorite open source tools, and they don't need to be grand OS query or some major, Falco super, something that's sitting on top of Kubernetes and diving into containers. It could be something that addresses a small pain point. Let us know. And we'd love to either highlight it here and talk with you about it, or we can throw it up into the show notes as well. And I think with that, we're also going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back with news of the week. Stay tuned.